We're so excited to have you here with us today for a webinar about the future of streets. And this webinar is co-hosted by Perkins and Will and Nelson Nygaard. My name is Leah Riley, and I am the Managing Director of Nelson Nygaard, and I have the pleasure of facilitating this webinar for you today. And we have a great panel for you. Today you're going to be hearing from Dan Lesser, who's the Director of Strategic Initiatives, Transportation and Public Works Department in the City of Boston. Warren Logan, who's the Policy Director of Mobility and Interagency Relations in the City of Oakland. Emily Warren, a Senior Policy Advisor with Nelson Nygaard. Jason Novsum, the Senior Associate for Nelson Nygaard, and Jerry Tierney, who's the co-director of the Mobility Lab with Perkins and Will. So we want to jump right into some key takeaways that we're hoping you all will depart with after seeing this presentation and the facilitated discussion. And those are to learn how cities have employed innovative tools and policies to quickly respond to changes in the demands placed on our streets. Consider how the vision for urban streets has changed from mobility-centric to people-centric. Explore a future of resilient streets that is dynamic, flexible, and agile when responding to the diverse needs of our communities. Learn how equitable streets serve people and strive to make the public realm a safe place for everyone. And can we recognize that on some streets that one modality may take precedence, where on another street that modality might be a guest and has to behave accordingly? And really importantly, whose street is it and what is it to be used for? Who gets to make these decisions? And how do we reconcile contradictory demands of a regional or city serving street from those of a neighborhood or residential street? And finally, do we all feel comfortable being in these streets? Are there unconscious cues or signals telling us that we do or do not belong here? And so to start us off, I'm turning it over to Jerry Tierney now, who's going to run through street context. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Leah. This is really a great panel. It's such an honor to have Warren and Dan and Emily. I mean, these are really three key players in dealing with contemporary streets in this kind of contemporary condition. So let's start establishing the context in which our discussion for streets is going to occur. So Jason, if you could just kind of get us going here. Yeah, we're going to look at the street through various lenses. I mean, typically we look at a street and we think of transit. But then as an urban designer, I might start looking at it as a spatial experience. But we also need to consider the social equity, public health, and then the environmental and economic impacts. So the street, we can see, is evolving. And in the evolution of the street, we need to consider the fact that the street evolves both temporarily in terms of a day of the week, whether it's a weekday, a weekend, whether it's 9 in the morning or midday or the evening. So there's an evolution in here. So let's go on the next. And you know, when I start looking at the street, and when Jason, my colleague from Nelson Nygaard, looks at the street, he's looking at it from the point of view of movement, transit, getting people going through a street. So what are those movements? Next. And so in those, we include, you know, obviously mobility. That's going to be people riding their bikes, driving their cars, taking the taxi. It's going to include transit. It's going to include micromobility. And in micromobility and bikes, it really should be for people who aren't just the key bike riders, but just anybody can get out there. But also another key component of transit is the sidewalk and people. And if we make these sidewalks delightful, but when we start looking at people, next, we have to really consider the equity issues that Leah mentioned. And are there signals there in this photograph here? People waiting for a bus at a stop that's temporary, but there's no street furniture to accommodate them. There's crowd control barricades in the background. I mean, all the signals here are wrong, as well as the infrastructure not accommodating their needs. Thanks. Well, you know, when I come in from Perkins and Will as an urban designer, I start looking at the activity. In other words, I look at the street transsectionally, cross-sectionally, whereas if from a transportation point of view, you're looking at it linearly, we're coming in from the side. So that activity takes on obviously retail, and that stores going, opening out onto the sidewalk, and we can look then at food and other kind of retail, like the next one. And coming up here is actually a shot, oops, we can go back. Well, anyway, let's stay on this one here. So there's an interesting etymology of the word for street. And in Chinese, ji usually means where the market, retail, and shops are. And it's interesting that with the etymology of the word street, that the very easy for them to, for in China, for people then to see the sidewalk and the street as being a place into which they move out into. And next. And so what that does is this creates a kind of a blurred edge of the street. And that blurred edge of the street then it looks at the center of the street as being maybe that's where the mobility happens, and that should be slow mobility. Maybe we should be looking at slower speeds, 20 to 30 kilometers per hour, 12 to 20 mile an hour speeds in our city streets. But then the edges should be flexible and allowing to adapt. And so if we look at the next slide here, which is what the phase we're in right now in adaptation. And so in adapting with the COVID-19, this is my local street here, Solano Avenue in Albany, and we see restaurants then putting out these barrels and umbrellas. And then if I'm on Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley, next slide, you know, and I want to go out to eat, we see restaurants having moved out into the parking stalls and taken that over. And so this is a form of adaptation that's getting close to the Xi meaning that the Chinese language has for the meaning of a street. And when we pull all this together, let's go on to the next slide. We need to also include the spatial. So here I'm going to take a cue out of cartography. And up until the middle of the 19th century, a standard practice in the cartographic illustrations of a city was to show not only the street, but also the public spaces of major public buildings. And I love this because this is showing the center of Dublin in Ireland with the Bank of Ireland to show St. Andrew's Church in there. And then over the right-hand side, it's got Trinity College, where I had the pleasure of presenting with Dan Burden about a year ago, this time last year, just in that little square that's in the right-hand side of the screen. But when you pull all of this together, and then let's go to the next slide. When you pull all this together, you have then a community agrees upon what are all the essential factors. And I love this illustration of what Beth Galley did in the city of Cork, where she took the main street in town, Patrick Street, and was able to bring all of these elements together into a beautiful ensemble that works for transit, transportation, for people, and street activity. And one thing we should not forget about is delight. Our streets really have to be delightful. And I just love this kind of serendipitous view here of being able to walk down a street. It's the middle of winter, the sun comes down almost in its Stonehenge-like, and it picks out this one street tree. So whenever we're talking about a street, remember, it's got to be a delightful place as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Jason Novsum. He's going to take you through the right-of-way allocation tool and some other things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry. So, thank you all for joining us today. So you've seen, through Jerry's presentation here, all of the really diverse and amazing uses that share our streets. And that includes both mobility and non-mobility uses. So, how do we actually approach this through our street design process? How do we remain comprehensive and inclusive of all of these various uses? So one approach that we've taken to this within Nelson Nygaard is through the development of what we call our right-of-way allocation tool set. So to understand why we need a right-of-way allocation tool set, first we need to talk about our overall future streets, resilient streets design strategy. So the first step in the strategy is we know that we want to develop a shared language. So for any of us who have worked on street designs, we understand there are many different stakeholders. We have the public, we have different municipal staff who may have very different perspectives. We want to help them talk to each other. It's okay that they may have different priorities, but we do want them to agree on how we actually assess a street's performance. So that is exactly where this right-of-way allocation toolset comes in. The next step in the process is looking at district level and regional level needs, and particularly understanding how those needs might vary in, say, a public health shock scenario like the one we're in today. And then finally, we know that we want to take the street to the street, or in other words, take all that great analysis that we've done, that shared language, and bring it to people in the community and say, hey, does this actually align with your day-to-day lived experience? So let's talk about the tool set itself here. So ultimately, the right-of-way allocation tool is a framework for people-centric street design. So it's something that takes a pretty standardized set of inputs, data about a street, traffic, like ped volumes, transit ridership, dimensions of the street, et cetera, and produces those key metrics to create that shared language. So this is something originally developed in 2019 by Nelson Nygaard on behalf of the city of Boston to accomplish exactly some of those goals and rethink the street design process. So what are these key metrics? So by far the most important one here that we'll talk to you about today is what we call maximum people served. So this is a people-centric way of looking at the street. You'll notice that it says people served. It's not just about throughput, because as Jerry illustrated to us, yes, mobility is an important part of the street, but we also have these non-mobility uses, dining, shopping, et cetera, that we want to think about when we're assessing a street's performance. So what this is going to tell us is how many people in total can use the space of the street within an hour safely and effectively. So that's our key metric. We are also able to produce several other metrics that we feel are very important to understanding a street's function: crash rates for every mode, particularly emphasizing those most vulnerable users, pedestrians and cyclists. We're able to look at intersection delay, again, for every mode, because yes, it is frustrating to wait at a red light, even for people who may not be in a car. We look at the real usage of the street, so how are people actually using it daily? Travel times, again, for every mode, so that can be very helpful in assessing, say, a dedicated bus lane. We look at bicycle level of traffic stress, so how safe and comfortable will our cyclists be on the street? We look at the people served per curbside space, and we'll talk about why that curbside space is just so important. And then finally, we have volume to capacity ratios, again, for every mode. I know that sounds kind of like a more traffic-oriented metric, but in fact, we can and do calculate that for every type of use on the street. So moving on here, let's take a look at one of the outputs from our tools. So Perkins and Will and Nelson Nygaard have teamed together to conduct a case study of this tool set, of this framework, in the Mission Bay area of San Francisco. So this is 3rd Street in Mission Bay. You can see the cross section here. You can see the feature that really stands out is we have this dedicated light rail infrastructure in the center of the street. Then we have 2 travel lanes in each direction, and then nice sidewalks on either side, no flexible curbside lane or parking lane. And what these bars are showing us here is actually how many people can safely and effectively use each part of the street within 1 hour. So the first thing that stands out there is that dedicated light rail infrastructure is able to serve so many more people. It's so much more productive, up to 3,000 people per hour compared to the same 12-foot travel lanes dedicated to a car. We can also see the pedestrian zones very, very productive as well. So the next thing we did here was look at this. Okay, this was our pre-COVID-19 street function. How has this actually changed during COVID-19? So you can see there's some pretty serious changes here. So the biggest one is now that light rail service is gone. It's been canceled and replaced with a bus service that no longer runs in that dedicated right-of-way. It actually is in a mixed travel lane. So we know that that capacity and that performance is going to go down. Of course, we also know that on each vehicle, we can only support half as many people because we do want people to remain socially distanced. And then the other thing that we notice is the pedestrian zone, that capacity is massively reduced as well. Again, we want people to stay 6 feet apart. We want them to stay healthy. So we really need to think about that as we're thinking about adapting this street. So that was a more transit-focused street. Let's take a look at 4th Street in San Francisco, which is 1 block away from 3rd Street. You can see it's a very different type of street. It's very pedestrian focused. It has very, very productive sidewalks on either side, serving a lot of people. We have 1 travel lane on each direction, bicycle lanes as well. And then we also have this flexible curbside lane that prior to COVID-19 is being used, just for parking. And what's really interesting here is you can see how few people a lane being used for parking is actually able to serve within an hour compared to any of these other uses. So it's something that we certainly want to keep an eye on. And then moving on, how does this street change during COVID-19? Well, again, we see that pedestrian capacity goes way down due to social distancing. We see that the capacity of the UCSF shuttle goes down. What's interesting there is that's actually serving a hospital nearby. So we know that we're going to need to add vehicles to serve the same number of people to reach that hospital during a public health shock. And then again, we see that curbside lane, it's still just being used for parking. So as we now start to think about how do we restore some of the function of the street, we definitely want to take a look at that. So that's how the street's function has changed. What about demands on the street? So we certainly know that the demand for open space, for green space right on our streets has risen. If I can't walk to a park or take transit to a park, if I want to stay healthy, I need that space actually within the street. We know that our indoor businesses now require outdoor space. That relationship's really strengthened. We know that commuting demand has become really variable. vehicular activity is down overall, transit demand may be down, particularly in higher income areas, but it actually has remained strong in areas with lower income workers who are often considered essential workers and will be commuting to work on a daily basis. So what are our key takeaways here? What are the lessons learned from this process, this design framework that we've developed? So I think the first one here is we know we need to leverage the existing strengths of a street. If we think back to 3rd Street, it had that incredible transit infrastructure, able to carry so many people during COVID-19 that could really be invaluable. We want to make sure we preserve that if we can. The next thing that we've learned is we really need to maximize flexible space in any future street designs. And perhaps the easiest and best place to do that is in that curbside lane. So if you take a look at the chart on the right here, you can see this is the number of people that a given 20-foot parking length curb space can serve across various uses. So if we use it for parking, only about 1 person in an hour can use that space. For bike, scooter storage, that's up to 5 people. If we look at parklets, dining areas, retail areas, we could have 10, 15, or 20 people potentially benefiting from that same space. And then finally, we know it's extremely important to stay in tune with the district level needs. So I would ask you to please turn your attention to these images here. These are photos that were taken on 3rd Street in San Francisco very recently. So you can see on the top, this is the Mission Bay neighborhood. It looks like someone, maybe they're working from home, they've got time between meetings, they decided to go out for a jog, and they realized, hey, I can actually jog in that canceled light rail right of way. So kind of an interesting reuse. They're able to socially distance. They don't even need to wear a mask because they have all this space to themselves. So that's working very well for them. But if we look 2 or 3 miles down the road, again, this is the same street in the Bayview area of San Francisco, you can see that these changes are playing out very, very differently. So we now have many more buses running on this corridor. The light rail is gone. We're trying to accommodate that transit demand. There's no formal waiting space. There's no formal bus stop. And people clearly still need access to that transit service. They're waiting, they're sort of crowded together. So this is just a big reminder to us that the street design-wise may look identical, but the needs and the function can be completely different. And before we turn it over to our other panelists, we do want to leave you with a statement here, which is be bold. Your street can take it. And what we mean there is, I think for those of us that have done this sort of work this year, we've seen we can take a travel lane, we can take a parking lane, and traffic flows will adapt. Those parked cars are going to find somewhere to go. And not only does it work, but it's often extremely popular as well. And if we stay focused on public health, economic outcomes for people, that's how we can really be successful. So with that, I will turn it back over to Leah.
Of course, my dogs start barking as soon as you try.
He likes what you said, Jason. Leah, you're on mute. There you go.
I know, because my dogs are barking. I'm so sorry. So let me get this in real quick before I get on mute. I'd love to, Warren, if you could talk to us a little bit about the Safe Streets program in Oakland while I get my dogs quiet.
Totally. Thanks, Leah. And I'm happy to report that my puppy is asleep in a chair and was not woken up by your dog. So thank you all. So I'm happy to kind of give a quick overview of Oakland's Slow Streets program. In April, we launched our Slow Streets program and made 74 miles of Oakland roadways eligible for what are called soft closures. And for anyone who's sort of following the last 6 or 7 months now, it's been a relatively successful program in a number of neighborhoods. And we found that for the neighborhoods that are less enthusiastic about the program, we've taken a really deep engagement approach to understand, what are the challenges that we're trying to really address and to fully reconcile that safety and security don't mean the same thing for everyone. And that perhaps even more importantly, the tools with which we, employ safe infrastructure may not meet everybody's needs or might cause people to relive past trauma. And so that's a major lesson learned for us. I'll dive in just slightly for a second, which is that for many cities, a lot of experts on the call too are aware that they've seen A-frames and wood barricades and sawhorses. And for us, that's worked in a number of neighborhoods that probably already had relatively low traffic to begin with. That said, though, we also found that construction barricades remind people of construction, and that's not always the best way to showcase Jerry, I think you said this, like delightful streets, right? Like exuberant excitement, right? So that's one space that we're already transitioning to. Leah, I'm sure you have more questions. I'm trying to pause while you have your...
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And again, thanks for bearing with me with my
No problem.
dogs, letting me know someone was at my door or something. Yeah, I would love to also just hear from Dan quickly about the city of Boston and how your street design process has changed, and if you could talk a little bit about how the application of the ROA tool was used in Boston. I think that'd be helpful for the audience.
Sure. I'm happy to do that, and thanks to Nelson Nygaard and Perkins Will for having me, and good to see everyone. Yeah, so we in 2017 in Boston put out Go Boston 2030, which is our strategic plan for transportation and mobility, which had pretty ambitious goals around increasing the percentage of people walking and biking and using mass transit, and at the same time significantly decreasing the number of people driving alone, and then also thinking about how do we get to Vision Zero on our streets for safety, and thinking about embedding equity and climate resilience across all of our work. And so as we had these really ambitious goals and we were taking on more and more projects, we were also in an old city that has narrow streets and some of the worst vehicle congestion in the country. And so we were in these situations of having these really hard trade-offs about how do we create more mobility options, and also dealing with multiple modes on a street and lots of vehicle congestion. And so we worked with Jason and Nelson Nygaard to help us to create that right-of-way allocation tool to think about, from a data-driven perspective, how do we think about some of those trade-offs along the streets? Right about when we were finishing it and starting to think about how to implement it, COVID happened. And that has really thrown things and really changed what we're doing. And so in the last, few months, we've done over 300 outdoor dining permits of taking street space for outdoor dining. We've added 6 miles of protected bike lane. We're doing 3 transit corridors. And we actually have kind of taken a different approach than the right-of-way allocation tool of more just let's do it. We're in an emergency, and we know that we need to create safer biking options for people to get around. We know that our transit use is much lower, but especially on bus and especially on specific routes, there's a lot of enduring ridership. So some bus routes are down to 20 or 30% of ridership, but others are at 60, 70%. And so we said on those routes where we have a lot of essential workers and are coming from places with high zip codes with high COVID rates, we're going to figure out how to get those buses moving faster. And so over the last few months, the city of Boston has kind of rethought our internal design and implementation project delivery process to go much faster. As of September, we had 8 miles of protected bike lane in the city. In 2 weeks, we'll have 14 miles. And figuring that out has been a whole process. And I know there'll be future questions. I'm happy to go into more depth about that.
Great, thank you. And Emily, I do have some questions for you. You were next, but I do want to come back to Warren just quickly because we had a question come up in the Q&A about stakeholder engagement and how you're doing outreach. And so Warren, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the city of Oakland did its outreach when designing the Safe Streets program, and like how do you reach stakeholders? Who are the important stakeholders to get? And talk a little bit about building consensus to get to implementation.
Yeah, I'll start from the beginning and go through. So there are a number of different ways that we gather feedback and engage our different neighborhoods. Similar to Boston's case, we actually pulled from our 2019 bike plan. And so we had just, when we were allowed to gather with people, we had just been gathering with folks at their community events, sharing with them the different ideas, understanding what their concerns were. And that was the basis for where Slow Streets really started. Moving forward into the physically distant present that we are dealing with right now during COVID, we engage in a number of ways. One is through Zoom. We have a weekly Zoom call with a number of advocates, both in the sort of like traditional transportation advocacy space. So that's Walk Oakland, Bike Oakland, that's Transport Oakland, that's Transform and Bike East Bay. And then we have and I think this is the critical component, is that we have a completely separate group that is the neighborhood groups that represent our priority neighborhoods, or as many of you might think of as our disadvantaged neighborhoods. And we wanted to be sure to kind of keep each of those their own space and voice so that we weren't kind of having people talk over each other, literally or figuratively, and to make sure that we were able to get into those deeper areas of conversation. In terms of software, I saw the question earlier, Leah, that, you know, in addition to Zoom, we just hired, well, just 6 months ago now, hired a new digital engagement officer who has been bringing some fantastic tools to the table. One of them is this way where, you know, we put up a little sign and it says, text this short number and say flex or slow, and it will spit out of a survey one text message at a time, and it'll tell you how to kind of respond. And we're just trying to meet people, like, of course, where they are with tools that they're very familiar with. Not everybody likes to go on a phone call and talk to people about their feelings. Not everyone has the time or energy or even technology to hop on a Zoom call. And not everyone wants to sit down for an online survey. So why not, you know, text them about it, right? I'm sure many of you, as you hopefully have all been voting, have been experiencing a lot of text messages lately about your opinions of other things. So we are backing off on that tool for a little bit to spare you. And then I think perhaps most importantly, from my part in our city, I still encourage people to just call me. You know, my office phone is now being sent to my cell phone, for better or for worse. And I'm happy to just have those long conversations with people about how their day is going and to try and pull from that what their different experiences are for our Slow Streets program or anything else related to transportation. So I guess I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks. So Emily, let's build on that a little bit. And when we're talking about implementation, maybe from your perspective, you can share with us, like, what are the big political headwinds that cities are going to be facing when trying to make these changes? And, you know, how can cities actually institutionalize these programs? Give us some tools and ideas.
Sure. Yeah, this is always the challenge, isn't it? Because I think it's so easy for planners among ourselves to come to a consensus around, you know, a kind of technocratic idea of what would be the right outcome, or even, you know, to go through the stakeholder engagement process and to get some great inputs and then come to a decision about what we'd like to do. But it can be quite another matter to actually get that through the process and get it enacted when we start to see opposition pop up from different corners, because people have different opinions and different needs about their use of the street. And so I think there are a couple of ways that we can take something like this great right-of-way allocation tool and actually, you know, kind of get it to have the political support that's necessary for it to be able to create lasting change. And I like thinking about taking a tool and turning it into a policy, because, you know, a tool is something we can kind of pull out of our tool belt and apply it to a particular project or a particular location. But a policy is something that expresses a broader, longer term intent about our values as a community. And so I love the idea that, inspired by kind of the principles of this kind of an allocation tool, you could actually kind of go up a level, whether that's, you know, at a departmental level with a city DOT, adopting a policy that the metrics that Jason described, that, you know, talk about all of the different things that we want to really optimize for around people and, you know, safety and equity in our street space, that are solved for through this allocation tool, that those goals are the ones that are our policy to advance as a department, and that we will use this tool as we evaluate our different projects moving forward to make decisions, so that happens in a systematic way. And then to even go a further higher level than that, I think the mayor and the city council have an important role to play. And it's interesting when you can get consensus at a political level as a community around what is the community that we want to live in look like and what are our values. You can adopt that in a broad way. And I've seen interesting examples, like when I was living in Boston and saw the city of Cambridge did something where they actually adopted a citywide policy that they were going to make sure that every street, when it got repaved, if it was named on the city's bike plan, was going to receive the facilities that were indicated on that plan. So it would happen automatically. And there didn't have to be these street by street kinds of battles where you could have, you know, kind of, you know, stalemate happen around the needs of that street, because everyone had agreed in advance at a citywide level, these are the things we want to achieve. And once we then apply that to this street, we could agree, okay, maybe this time we're going to go back and forth about the process, but we've agreed that this is the process that makes sense to us to incorporate everyone's views and express our values in that way, and we can live with the outcome.
Great. So, Dan, coming back to you, there was a question I wanted to ask of you, and then Karen LeBlanc, one of my dear friends, thanks for showing up, also popped a question into the Q&A that was similar to what I was going to ask, and I wanted you to expound upon how in the city of Boston you've got agreement, or people to come to the understanding that not all streets are the same. Different streets serve different purposes, and they can be viewed differently. And Karen's question was, how do you get cities to understand or agree to that approach? And so can you share a little bit about your experience in Boston and getting people there?
Yeah, happy to do that. Yeah, so I think it's been interesting during this time of COVID, where traffic volumes are much lower. And I think we've been trying to see it both as a crisis and an opportunity to try some things that we couldn't have tried before. And so I think we have been saying, why don't we just put it in? And we've been using more temporary materials. It's been an iteration. First, we just put in cones and barrels and plastic jersey barriers out to try to place some places that we knew had big mobility needs and had some really big safety issues. And then we are now going back and putting them into pavement marking and flex posts. And for 2 of those streets, we're planning $5 to $10 million reconstructions of those streets coming up. And in at least one of those projects, the community process was really stuck, where I think we were talking about going from 4 to 2 lanes on a major street, that we knew there were some big safety issues, and we knew that the lane reduction would help with the speeding issues and the safety issues, along with creating bike facilities. And I think there was some people in the community who were really supportive, and some people who it was a really scary idea. And so what we've done is, first we put out barriers to try it out, and we got some positive feedback. We also got some negative feedback. And I think similar to what Warren was saying, I think some people experienced just having those barriers didn't feel right. It also was kind of imperfect in a lot of ways. And now we're coming back actually tonight, doing pavement markings and flex posts, where we can do a much better job with trying this out. And that is paving the way literally for a full $11 million reconstruction in about a year to year and a half. And so I think trying something bold and trying it in an iterative way, in a way that in a full reconstruction we wouldn't usually do, has been one thing that we've been experimenting during this time of COVID.
Great, thank you. Emily, I want to come back to you for a minute. You know, when the city does outreach or engagement, they really tend to focus on adjacent, property owners or residents along the corridor. I mean, I'd just love to hear from your perspective about how ideas to do engagement a little bit differently, and talk about how possibly people are getting left behind or voices aren't being heard in the typical engagement process that cities run.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I notice it when I get things in my mailbox that are coming to me because I'm in a butter in the home that I own for changes that are happening on nearby streets. And, that's great. It is important to hear from people that are property owners, or from, the owners of retail businesses in particular places. But sometimes the folks that don't get asked are the ones who find themselves in those spaces because they need to come there to work, or because they need to pass through as a pedestrian or as a cyclist or as a driver or transit rider. And we're not necessarily always as creative about finding ways to reach those folks. And I think Warren actually highlighted some really great strategies that they've put in place in Oakland, identifying community-based organizations that maybe represent some of those folks at a citywide level, so that they're hearing from people who may be constituents of a particular street, even though they're not a resident on that street or a property owner on that street. It really is to some extent a kitchen sink approach, needing to think about these different axes and sources on which people are organized, whether they're organized based on their identities, and it's important to talk to different identity groups of people that have things in common across the city that may be represented by organizations, and also to go through these these sort of physical ways of reaching out. I love the the kind of text message approach. I've seen those signs actually around Oakland to chime in about the flexible spaces being allocated to retail businesses. And that's really creative, because then you're actually kind of placing something in the public right of way to catch the eyes of the individuals who may be passing through, who might not be accessible through engagement with some of these other groups. Because sometimes, you know, it's really true that the people who don't show up or don't have the time and resources to show up to a Zoom meeting, or certainly an in-person meeting in the before times, are often the ones who are the most overlooked and have the needs that are most acute for us to pay attention to as policymakers.
Thanks. So Warren, I'll come back to you, and a question came up in the Q&A that also was one of the questions I was thinking about answering you. And someone, Carol, was asking how streets maybe can be flexible with changing of seasons. And she was like, that's sort of a 20,000 foot view. I was actually going to get down on the ground and say, like, is there a possibility, and are you thinking about in Oakland, and maybe even you, Dan, next on this, can the street be more flexible, like on a weekly basis, a daily basis? And are you thinking about taking the program in that direction?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So some of the feedback, kind of back to Emily's point too, some of the feedback we received from our East Oakland neighbors especially was that they weren't necessarily against the idea of having safe streets. I think a lot of people heard that and was like, I need you to not, people are telling you not to have safe streets. Like, let's park that over here. Some people said though, on the weekends, it would be really great to be able to like close the street completely down for a barbecue or a cookout or farmer's market. Others, actually a number of parents had shared with us, in fact, in your neighborhood, Emily, that they would have appreciated saying, well, during the mornings, the street's open, but after school, basically, when the kids come home and the parents pick them up, that's when everybody acknowledges that it's calm enough to let the kids go out and play out in the street. I remember that, I'm not that old, but I remember doing that with my brothers, especially. So to answer Carol's question, it's certainly something we're looking into. It's a matter of how, right? And so we just recently launched a pilot within a pilot within a pilot, I guess, where we received a small grant from Smart Growth America to create strategies along a couple of East Oakland slow streets. And one of the main for the art that we put out, in addition to it being some cool planters, was that they're on casters. And so you can move them into place, and that there are enough of them that they sort of stack on the side when you want them to, or if you want, you can actually take them all the way across the street and then kind of set up, your makeshift soccer, space or whatever. And so we're trying to figure out how we can give our residents the tools they need to be flexible within sort of that like paradigm of safety and culture keeping at the same time. I will admit, we do not have a silver bullet. We are trying to figure out along the way. And that's, I think, the part that Dan probably brought up a bit too, is we're, instead of waiting and waiting and waiting and planning for years to kind of keep talking about something, we're just saying, I want to try your idea. Let's see what it looks like tomorrow. If it's not working, we're going to switch it. And that level of iteration is something that none of us are used to. But I have found, especially in terms of engagement, that people are responding a lot better to the faster clip that we are making these changes. And so if someone says, oh, I'm not happy, they're not, pressing the panic button anymore, because they recognize now, hopefully, that if it's not working, next week we'll change it. If it's not working again, we'll shift it again. And that there's this constant call and response now that people feel they're a part of, that I think has become a lot more engaging, I would say fun, and hopefully a lot more equitable as well.
And I can jump in a little bit on the flexibility of streets. I think it's something we're struggling with as well. But I think we've learned a lot through the process. My colleague Matt Warfield, who is on this call, a big shout out to him, who's overseeing the outdoor dining process. And it's getting cold here, and so our restaurants are really scared about what's going to happen when they can't do outdoor dining. Indoor dining is very limited. And so we just approved space heaters to get them through December. But I think we're gonna be figuring out of like how do we take that out and get it back in. But I think on the mobility front, we've got some new tools in the toolbox now. We spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on barriers and cones and barrels. So we have this whole set of things that we can deploy. We've taken them out for the winter, but we can deploy again. And then I think from internal perspective of just figuring out with our operations staff, and they've been real heroes of doing things that they've never done before, of kind of how to get those out, how to monitor them, how, you know, and I think we had a lot of fear when we first put out over 1,000 barrels in our downtown to put temporary bike lanes all across our downtown, that like every night they were going to be thrown across the street and that we weren't going to be able to keep them up. And we spent a lot of time worrying about it. And then it's been a non-issue, you know, very minor stuff. And so I think there's no easy answer on how to keep the streets flexible, but I think we now have a toolkit in a way that we didn't before, and the actual infrastructure to do it. And so I think we're excited. We had a long discussion about, we had these 400 plastic jersey barriers. We were taking them out to put in striping. And then we're like, do we sell them or do we keep them? And we had to figure out where to put them, which is a big challenge, but we decided to keep them. So we said, let's keep this tool. And that, you know, in the spring, let's figure out where else we would want to put them out so we can try other things with the community and see what they think.
Thank you. I do want to dedicate some of the time. We did have some people who registered and send in questions in advance, so I want to try to get to some of those in the time that we have left. And so we're kind of at this high level. And Jason, I want to put you on the spot if I can and take you down to a little bit more granular level. And someone wants to know, does the peak hour analysis mean anything anymore? And how reliable is a 20-year forecast when given COVID and post-COVID environment?
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent question. And frankly, you know, I think we're all grappling with that, right? I think at a very high level, the answer to that is the peak hour analysis is certainly not as important as we have traditionally given it credit for, right? I think we see how activities vary throughout the day. We see how different modes, their activity levels rise and fall. We certainly shouldn't always make it our go-to, right? To look at, okay, 4 to 5 p.m., what's happening? There's all these cars out here. Okay, now we need to blow up this street. That's absolutely not the approach we want to take. And I think in our internal design processes, you know, moving to more innovative metrics, like for example, people served, it's not just about how many cars can we move or even how many bikes and peds can we move through a corridor. It's about thinking about the service to the community, the service to the district at large, that the street can offer, you know, as a, you know, part of the public realm. So I think, you know, to add to that, I would also say, yes, we're developing new tools to do that sort of analysis, but we definitely do not view those tools as a be-all, end-all approach. It's not something that you put in your data, it spits out your outputs, and now you know what to do. It has to come back to the community. It has to be taken through the approach that, you know, Dan and Warren have both described really, really well. You know, this is about improving our thought process, right? And it's great that it's data-driven, but it's about how we're thinking. It's not, you know, part of the old way of saying, okay, we've done this analysis. It says we have to do this, and that's what we're going to do.
Thank you. So, Emily, I think I'm going to ask this one to you. This is a criticism that often comes in when we do street transformations in any city. There's often the criticism is with value that these often take place in areas of higher wealth and higher income neighborhoods. And just, so what's your advice to cities, and how can we make sure that when we're making flexible streets and adapting to changes, that we're being equitable and considering diverse communities in what we're doing?
It's so critical. And I think it is something that happens often, you know, despite the best intent of planners, but it reveals some of the blind spots that we have in the way that we construct our processes and our priorities. Because, you know, sometimes you can have a, you know, perfectly well-intentioned process that just says, well, we're gonna take input and hear where people's priorities are for us to focus with our investments. And then it happens to be the rich white people that, you know, show up to the meeting and are the squeaky wheels, and they're the ones that really, you know, put the bug in the ear of their city council person over and over again to get that word down, to have their street prioritized. And that ends up over time accumulating to a very inequitable investment of resources, right? So this means that we need to seek out, not just be reactive, and wait to hear from the community about, what they, think the prioritization of our investments should be, but actually know in advance that this structural inequality is going to, without our active intervention and intent, going to result in a perpetuation of structural racism, of, the unequal treatment of different communities within our city, and that we need to design processes to seek out input that will correct that proactively, right? And that can look like some of the kinds of public engagement strategies that we talked about previously. I think, there's another part of the city DOT in Oakland that Warren works with that has put a lot of effort into a really equity-focused paving plan that is a model for how to think about that, right? And trying to actively actually prioritize communities we might hear from less, but where we have been able to assess the conditions in those areas and recognize the fact that they need to receive attention. So I think it's about kind of being an active participant in seeking out the problems and correcting them, rather than waiting to receive input from the people who already participate the most.
Thanks, Emily. I want to move on to a question from Ronit, and please forgive me if I pronounced your name incorrectly. But I think I'm going to kick this one to Warren, because given that your role is sort of liaison across a couple of different areas, Ronit is asking, are there ways that we can connect public health and community events that, because DOTs are so siloed from other people who have a role in the decision-making process and are just as impactful, how do we get those links built up in our cities?
Yeah, that's another really great question. And it's funny that, obviously it's smart that it's coming up now, because it's exactly what's on everyone's minds, right? Like, how do we address COVID and understand then, for many of us, right, transportation planners, the ways in which we can plug in. On one hand, I think many of us know this to be true, that just the other, I can't call it a pandemic anymore, but the other tragedy of how many people die on our streets every single month, every single year, every single day by getting hit by cars is another tragedy, right? And that has public health impacts. That alone should make anybody want to engage about how transportation planning, how these types of design treatments and the ways in which they're enforced play out from a public health standpoint. The other thing, though, that we're finding in the case of what's happening here in Oakland, and it's funny because just a few hours before this conversation, I had another call with the county and several of our lawyers to talk about how we're going to open up our streets to pop-up testing events. Many of you have probably, tried to find testing for COVID and drive-through parking lots, and that's fantastic. That is one of the ways in which we've seen a lot of people be able to safely gather, I guess, physically distant in their cars and get rapid testing for COVID. We found, though, that there are lots of people, of course, who do not have cars or are not willing to drive to those long distances because they're unable to. And so then what's the best way for us to provide that type of service that's so needed right now, right in the neighborhoods that are needed most? And so we're using our rights of way, just like the streets, just like flex streets, again, creatively to meet the community needs for this pandemic. And so we're going to start seeing, hopefully next week, I think, what's it, Thursday? So yeah, next week, for these kinds of healthy streets, right? To create spaces for people to walk up, get tested, and then move on. And what's exciting, and I think this is to your point, Emily, especially about equity, is that a number of people have said, well, there aren't flex streets in deep East Oakland, and there aren't slow streets in these pockets. And one of the things that I've shared specifically with my staff has been, we need to be looking at all of our streets together and thinking about how every neighborhood has access to their streets in the ways that they need them. So you may not see pop-up testing in North Oakland because they don't need it, right? You will see pop-up testing in deep East Oakland or in West Oakland, for example. And the goal is that our streets, and I think Jason and Jerry really opened us up with this, that our streets are meeting the needs whenever the community says, okay, we need testing, we need outdoor recreation space, we need safe streets, et cetera. And that's the metric that I would always use to evaluate if our streets are being successful, or even to use your word, Jerry, delightful, is if they are meeting the needs in that moment or across the weeks or the days or even the year for that matter.
Thanks, Warren. Dan, I think I'm gonna kick the next question to you. There is so much excitement building around taking parking spaces for outdoor dining space or other uses to try to help, the restaurant industry survive and have people who have, gathering places. And there's a real desire from a lot of people to make sure that those parking spaces continue to be used for something different even after COVID. And I was just wondering if the city of Boston is thinking about this, and if there are, plans in place and how you'll engage the community to continue to repurpose parking spaces for higher and better people service.
Yep. I think it's a great question. And a bunch of my colleagues have been thinking about that and working on that. I think we're in the midst of evaluating how all this taking of parking on our main streets went for outdoor dining. And I think generally it was very positive. And I think we saw that our streets could handle it, and that it really added, as kind of Jerry was saying earlier, added a lot of vibrancy to our streets. And so I think the mayor has already said in Boston that we're planning to bring them back in the spring, the outdoor dining. And I think my hope is that it's going to allow additional rethinking of what the streets can look like, and more openness to flexibility, because I'm in Boston, and I'm sure like many cities across the country, taking of parking is really always a kind of third rail and can cause huge battles, and especially with business owners in Main Street districts. And so I think it's been interesting, and I haven't been as close to that work around the outdoor dining, but I'd be interested to see how business owners are feeling now with all that's happened, and how that space has been able to support their restaurants about changes in parking.
Great. Warren, I think I'll give this question over to you. What are and I'm sure that you came head to head with this in Oakland, so your experience will be helpful here. It's just the question from one of our attendees is like, how do you make sure that when you're investing in these different uses of the street, that you aren't displacing local residents? And if I can kind of probably read into the mind of the person who sent in this question, it's quite often that, cities will come in and make investments that make areas more attractive, and that leads to greater, economic uptick in that area, and then it becomes more attractive and desirable. People get pushed out. So I think that's what the question is kind of getting at. So I'd love to hear your perspective from the city of Oakland.
Yeah, and that was an early criticism that we received when we launched Slow Streets, was the city is out to kick out its Black neighbors. And I'm going to be honest with you, A, that's not the goal. B, I think that every single neighborhood deserves safe streets. And I often encourage people to think a little bit harder about like what the and this is not a criticism of whoever has asked that question, but I've received this criticism a lot, is are making streets safer the cause of gentrification and displacement? And I just don't know if that question gets us very far, because it's like, so are you saying we shouldn't make streets safer, right? Like that's ultimately where a lot of the debates that I get to end up, which is like, well, I guess we shouldn't do whatever that investment is. And in Oakland, what we've started to say is, well, what are the ways in which we can make those streets safer, in this case, that are meeting these community needs? And this is, I think, where a lot of folks have now started to say, well, maybe the bike lane isn't the way to go, right? Like we've heard from a number of residents. I live in West Oakland, and many of my neighbors have said, yeah, I want that street to be calmer and I want it to be narrower, but I'm not asking for bikeways. I'm asking for wider sidewalks. I'm asking for street trees. Underneath all of that though, and this is my not sharp criticism of questions like that, but my active encouragement for a deeper dialogue is that the reason that those types of, or that people feel those types of investments cause gentrification is not because of transportation. It's because we don't build enough housing. It's because we don't have enough access to jobs. It's because we don't have enough affordable housing. And better yet, and most importantly, people don't own their homes, right? Like in California, we have a lot of people. In fact, we have a majority of renters in Oakland. That is a major reason why we have this friction between government investment, or even private investment for that matter, and then people feeling pressed out. But if you ask someone blanketly, should I make your street safer? They're not going to say no. They might say, well, what do you mean by that? But I often encourage, well, I always encourage people to kind of dig a little bit deeper than this binary of, if I calm the street, Black people are going to get kicked out of the neighborhood, because like that's we can't operate in that type of a binary, because it leaves people to then say, I guess we shouldn't make Black and brown neighborhoods safer, right? It is also, in fact, the same feedback that I actually received from many of our Deep East Oakland neighbors who said at first, we don't want slow streets because we don't want more people bicycling in our neighborhood. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna dig deeper than that, because you and I both know that at the beginning of this year, we lost 3 different moms crossing the streets in Deep East Oakland, picking up their kids. Like, that type of a trauma, as people are being let out of school and watching their families getting run over by cars, is not something I'm willing to continue to allow. And so I'm gonna like climb down from my soapbox now, but my point is that I don't want to continue asking questions like that, because it forces us into the space of like continuously disinvesting in those types of neighborhoods, and instead ask, what are the culturally sensitive ways to increase safety for neighborhoods, while also ideally finding complementary strategies that help them invest in their homes and stick in place. But you're not going to resolve displacement with bike lanes, right? Like with less bike lanes. You're not going to resolve displacement with slow streets, right? Like these are not the same thing. They are part of a broader conversation, which is that we don't build enough housing in California, and we don't allow people the opportunities to own their homes, even though they've been renting so long that they practically could have bought the home themselves. End of soapbox, but that's my feedback on that question.
That's a beautiful soapbox, thank you. We're nearing the end of our time here, and so I wanted to ask each of our panelists the same question. So if you each have about roughly a minute, and I'll start with you, Dan, if that's okay. This was an attendee question, and I think it's a great one to close out the session is, what do you believe is going to stick post-COVID, and how can people influence the city about what stays and what goes?
Yeah, I think first, just from internal, how we operate dynamic, I think we just learned a lot how to do things quickly and how to use new tools that allows us to get things that are implemented much quicker. I think on the external front, I think it's what's going to stay is, I feel like, what we're hearing from the community that's working. And so I think we'll be trying to listen deeply and understand kind of what worked, but also what not everything worked that we did. And so I think that's our next homework. And then I think we didn't really get into it, but like Oakland, we've tried all these new and different engagement efforts. And so I think we've learned a lot about how to do engagement better, even in a post-COVID world. And so I think those more equitable and effective engagement strategies will stay.
All right. Emily, you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, well, I think it all comes down to what Jerry talked about earlier when he talked about delight. I think we've been able to really delight people with the way that slow streets have invited people to play and to reclaim some of that space in their residential neighborhood streets, where they can now have their children out there, they can be walking, they can be jogging with a little bit more space. And I don't think people are going to want to surrender that and get stuck back into the sidewalks and surrender all that space back to cars. So I think we're going to see, especially in residential areas, a lot of momentum behind the idea that we should maintain some of these policies around pedestrians and cyclists being able to use the full street, and having through traffic only. And it may take different forms in different places, but I doubt that that's going to go away. We heard Warren before this conversation sharing that, people were begging and saying, don't you dare take away my slow streets. So I know when we hear that there's some momentum there. And then it's certainly on the retail front, reclaiming parking spaces to put in extensions of seating, outdoor seating for restaurants. I mean, I think people have just realized that it's so much nicer, it's so much better. And gosh, don't we wish like it was like this all the time, when you see that your community can all of a sudden look like a European plaza, right? So I think a lot of restaurants are going to want to retain that, and business owners have such a voice in how these decisions are made. I think a lot of that is going to stick around as well.
All right, we only have a minute left. Warren, you want to close us out with your thoughts?
Sure. In one word, flexibility. We are going to maintain the type of flexibility that we've had during this pandemic, so that no matter what kind of requests people are needing from us, we're going to meet them with how might we approach and be flexible about the ways in which we accomplish those goals.
Great. It was so inspiring to hear all of you today, and thank you so much for your participation. And Jason and Jerry, great job with the lead up and the technical presentation beforehand. So for those of you who are still with us, we are recording this and we will make it available. So stay tuned to get a copy of that. And thanks to everybody, and have a great rest of your day, great weekend. Cheers.